In 1933, a man named Maurice Wilson set out to climb Mount Everest alone. He had never climbed a mountain before. He had never trained at altitude. He had almost no proper gear. What he had instead was a belief so total, so consuming, that it overrode every rational instinct of self-preservation. He believed that prayer and fasting could heal the human body of anything, and he was determined to prove it to the world from the highest point on Earth. At the time, Everest was not just a mountain, it was the edge of the known world. On British survey maps, the summit was literally a blank space, an unfilled sketch where certainty ran out. But Maurice Wilson was not afraid of blank spaces. He was drawn to them. This is the unbelievable, heartbreaking story of Maurice Wilson, the man who tried to climb Everest with faith as his only gear. Maurice Wilson was born in 1898 in Bradford, England, a hard-working, working-class city in the north. Like so many young men of his generation, he was thrown into adulthood by the horrors of World War I, enlisting at just 18 years old. He didn't just fight at Passchendaele, as history sometimes records. His defining moment came at the Battle of Wytschaete, part of the Messines offensive, where he manned a machine gun post alone, holding the position for 10 hours while the men around him were cut down. For this, he was awarded the Military Cross. He came home with a stiff left arm and constant pain from his wounds, but the physical scars were almost secondary. The war had carved something deeper into him, a restlessness, a searching quality, a need to find meaning that the ordinary world couldn't satisfy. He drifted New Zealand, South Africa, the United States, Europe. He married twice, both marriages ended. He ran a dress shop in New Zealand for a while, an odd footnote in an increasingly strange life. He explored Buddhism and Eastern philosophy. He searched for something he couldn't name. Then, in 1932, he found it. On board the SS Multan, sailing back to England, Maurice Wilson collapsed. Tuberculosis, a death sentence for many in the 1930s, with no reliable treatment and a bleak prognosis. Desperate, he turned to a spiritual healer in London's upscale Mayfair district. What followed was a strict 35-day fast and regime of prayer, and then, against all odds, he recovered, fully. To the medical establishment, it was an anomaly. To Maurice Wilson, it was a revelation. He believed he had unlocked a hidden truth, that the human body, when aligned with faith and stripped of everything worldly, could heal itself of anything. He now had a message. What he needed was a stage big enough to prove it. That stage found him in a cafe in Germany, of all places, where he read about the tragic 1924 British Everest expedition. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine had vanished somewhere above 28,000 feet, last seen climbing toward the summit. Their bodies had never been found. That's when inspiration, or madness, depending on your perspective, struck. Wilson would climb Everest, alone, without conventional mountaineering methods. He would prove that prayer, fasting, and sheer willpower could take a man to the roof of the world. Whether anyone believed him or not was irrelevant. He believed it, and that was enough. To understand just how extraordinary Wilson's plan was, you need to understand what Everest meant in 1933. The mountain had only been formally recognized as the world's highest peak in the 1850s after the British completed their Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, measuring distances and elevations with vast, heavy brass instruments across hundreds of miles of subcontinent. The surveyors never even reached the Himalayas directly. They calculated the peak's height by triangulation from observation stations 150 miles away. Since then, Everest had been a symbol of the very limit of human ambition. Political tensions in Tibet and Nepal made access almost impossible. In the 1920s, 3 British expeditions had tried to summit it. All had failed. And the 1924 climb had ended in tragedy, with Mallory and Irvine swallowed by cloud on the upper mountain. The mountain had become a legend, a deadly one. Most serious mountaineers quietly believed it might be beyond human reach. Wilson's plan had a certain deranged elegance to it. He would buy a small plane, fly solo from England to India, then crash land on the lower slopes of Everest and climb to the summit on foot. There were two problems. He had never flown a plane, and he had never climbed a mountain. Neither detail deterred him. He bought a second-hand Gypsy Moth biplane, that's Gipsy, as de Havilland spelled it, and christened it Everest. A pun on Everest, yes, but also on ever wrestling with fate. He took flying lessons. He wasn't a natural. He failed his flight tests and at one point crashed the plane in a field near Bradford before he'd even left the county. The Air Ministry, alarmed by both his plans and his flying, issued an official ban. Wilson was forbidden from making the journey. As for mountaineering, he figured it couldn't be too difficult. He trained by hiking in Snowdonia, Wales, and the Lake District, where on one occasion he got stuck on a practice climb and had to be helped down by locals. He brushed it off, telling them the Himalayas would be flatter. To build stamina, he walked from London to Bradford and back, roughly 400 miles on foot, and considered himself ready. In the meantime, Wilson was building something else, a public profile. He contacted newspapers, gave interviews, and quickly became a sort of eccentric underdog. The British public, charmed by his stubbornness and refusal to listen to authority, began rooting for him. The elite Royal Alpine Club was not charmed. They had spent decades establishing the proper, professional approach to mountaineering, and they had no interest in an unqualified amateur stealing the glory of Everest. They lobbied the Air Ministry. The ban was confirmed. But Maurice Wilson didn't back down. He never did. May 21st, 1933, his 35th birthday. He had chosen the date deliberately to mark the day he flew away from his old life. He ignored the ban, climbed into the Everest, and took off solo, beginning a 5,000-mile journey toward the highest mountain on Earth. Wilson flew in short hops of roughly 620 miles. He had no sophisticated navigation equipment, no radio, no official flight plan. His primary navigation tool was a pageant of History Atlas, a children's school book, and directions he scrawled on the back of his hand. He navigated largely by following coastlines. The journey nearly killed him several times over. Over Persia, modern-day Iran, he was nearly shot down. He had no permits to fly through Persian airspace and had to talk his way out of being grounded by authorities on the ground. He flew through a massive sandstorm over the desert, blind, hoping the compass was pointing the right direction. When he ran low on fuel in the middle of the desert, he landed wherever he could find flat ground and waited for passing camel caravans to point him toward the nearest town. Ignoring repeated government orders to turn back, he pressed on, arriving in Karachi 2 weeks after leaving Bradford. For a man with barely any flight training and zero official backing, it was nothing short of miraculous. The plane was battered, so was he, but he'd done it. The celebration didn't last. By now, authorities had caught wind of Wilson's plan, not just the Nepalese, but the British Raj itself. The India office was terrified he would cause a diplomatic incident with Tibet, which jealously guarded access to Everest's northern approach. They forbade him from flying over Nepal or Tibet. The Everest was impounded. When Wilson couldn't pay the fines and debts that had accumulated, he was forced to sell it. The plane that had carried him halfway across the world was gone, and it had been taken by his own government. Wilson was furious, then quiet, then calculating. He headed east by train and foot to Darjeeling, the hill station in northeastern India that served as the staging point for Himalayan expeditions. There, he waited out the winter. He shaved his head. He practiced sitting in silence. He studied the route maps and any expedition accounts he could find. He hatched a new plan. In spring, he would sneak into Tibet on foot, disguised as a local pilgrim, and approach Everest from the north. On March 21st, 1934, Wilson and 3 Sherpas slipped quietly out of Darjeeling before sunrise. Their names were Tuwang, Rinsing, and Siring. Rinsing was a veteran of both the 1924 and 1933 Everest expeditions, a man who had seen serious mountaineers in action. That he agreed to accompany Wilson speaks to something. Perhaps he respected the Englishman's conviction, or perhaps he simply wanted to see what would happen. Since travel in Tibet was strictly restricted, they disguised themselves as Buddhist pilgrims. Wilson, unable to speak either Tibetan or Nepali, wore a turban and traditional kalat dress and had stained his skin with tea and dye. He played the role of a deaf mute, a wise precaution since opening his mouth would have given him away instantly. For 3 weeks, they moved through jungles and across freezing high plains, sleeping in valleys, avoiding villages, moving at dawn and dusk. 300 miles on foot, in secret, at altitude. On April 14, 1934, they arrived at the Rongbuk Monastery, the ancient Tibetan Buddhist monastery at the foot of Everest's north face, sitting at roughly 16,000 feet. It was the closest human outpost to the mountain, and the monks who lived there had watched many expeditions come and go. They were stunned to see this gaunt, stained Englishman arrive among them, calling himself a European Lama. Wilson fasted and prayed at the monastery for 2 days. Then he loaded his 45-pound pack, dates, rice, a silver mirror to signal his progress to the monastery below, a diary, his mauve wool jumper, and set off alone. What Wilson now faced was the East Rongbuk Glacier, one of the most treacherous approaches on the entire mountain. A massive, shifting river of ice riddled with hidden crevasses, ice towers, and maze-like passages that even experienced climbers navigated with caution. Wilson had no crampons, no guide, and no real understanding of glacier travel. He got completely, dangerously lost. For 5 days, he wandered through a labyrinth of ice, unable to find the route used by previous expeditions. Then the weather turned, snow and wind blinded him. He became trapped above 21,000 feet, alone in his tent, growing weaker by the hour. When the storm finally lifted, Wilson knew he had to retreat. He scrambled more than 5,000 feet down the glacier in a single day, a feat that, in his condition, probably should have killed him. By the time he stumbled back to the Rongbuk Monastery, he was barely recognizable. His eyes were swollen shut from snow blindness. He was dehydrated, frostbitten, and barely conscious. His old war wound, the stiff left arm, had seized up in the cold. He had a twisted ankle and a suspected fractured rib. It took him 18 days to recover. When he finally got back on his feet, he made his announcement. He was going up again. The Sherpas stared at him. On May 12, 1934, they set out again. This time, the Sherpas accompanied Wilson as far as Camp 3, an abandoned site from the previous year's British expedition, stocked with leftover supplies, tins of food, chocolate, biscuits, jam, even butter. Wilson, the man of fasting and prayer, tucked in happily. He also found a pair of ice crampons, metal spikes designed to grip ice walls. He tried them on, decided they were unnecessary, and left them behind. It was one of the most consequential decisions of his life, because what stood between Wilson and the upper mountain was the North Col, a 40-foot wall of near vertical ice that required crampons, proper ice axes, and technical skill to climb. Wilson attacked it with a standard stepping axe, the wrong tool entirely, and his bare leather boots. He attempted to hack steps into the ice, one by brute force. For 4 straight days, he threw himself at that wall. Each attempt ended the same way. Each failure cost him more of his dwindling reserves. Eventually defeated, he returned to Camp 3. The Sherpas, who had watched with increasing dread, begged him to turn back to India. They had families, they had their own lives, and they had now seen enough to know that going higher meant death. Wilson collapsed into his tent and lay there for 2 days, feverish, barely able to move. The headaches at altitude were crippling. His body was beginning to shut down, but something else was happening too. In his diary, which was not just a log but a conversation with God, filled with references to vibrations and divine protection, he wrote about sensing a presence beside him, an invisible companion on the edge of consciousness. "It's strange," he wrote, "but I feel that there is somebody with me in the tent all the time." Mountaineers call it the third man phenomenon. At extreme altitude and exhaustion, the brain manufactures the companion. Wilson experienced it as confirmation, proof that his divine protection was real. The Sherpas had seen enough. They refused to go any further. They begged Wilson one last time to come down with them. He refused. He told them to wait 10 days. If he hadn't returned by then, they were to go home without him. On May 29, 1934, Tuang, Rinzing, and Siring left Camp 3. Wilson was alone. He spent 2 more days in his tent, resting, writing, and then on May 31st, he packed his small load, stepped outside into the cold blue morning, and wrote his final diary entry. 4 words. Off again. Gorgeous day. He stepped out of the tent and walked toward the mountain. He was never seen alive again. A year later, in 1935, a British expedition led by Eric Shipton came across Wilson's body high on the East Rongbuk Glacier. He was lying on his left side, his old war wound side. He was wearing his mauve wool jumper and gray flannel trousers, no coat, no boots on. He had apparently stopped mid-preparation, as if he had simply sat down to rest and never gotten back up. He had died of exposure and exhaustion just a few hundred feet from a food cache left by the 1933 expedition. The mountain had offered him salvation at the last, and he had been too weak to reach it. Among his belongings, a woman's high-heeled shoe. No one knows why. Some historians have speculated it was a keepsake. Some have suggested Wilson was a cross-dresser. A theory reignited when a Chinese expedition found a similar shoe at 21,000 feet in 1960. The mystery has never been resolved. It remains one of the most quietly surreal details in the entire story. Shipton's team wrapped what remained of Wilson in his shredded tent and dropped him into a deep crevasse as close to a burial as the mountain allowed. That should have been the end. But the East Rongbuk Glacier moves a few feet downhill each year, an inexorable slow march, and every so often, as the ice shifts and calves, Maurice Wilson comes back. His remains have resurfaced in 1959, 1975, 1986, and 1999. Each time, expedition teams have reburied what they found. Each time, the glacier gives him back. Everest, it seems, is not finished with Maurice Wilson.